There is a strange hush that follows seasons of pain, as if the soul itself pauses to understand what just changed. What once felt endless suddenly becomes distant, like a storm that no longer has permission to return. In that quiet space, something deeper than relief begins to speak, something like mercy wrapped in finality. It is not merely the end of suffering, but the beginning of a truth you were too weary to notice before. And in that truth, a voice seems to whisper that what broke you has also been bound from returning again. There are moments in a human life when what once ruled the inner world begins to lose its authority, not through force, but through a quiet decree that seems to descend from a place beyond emotion and circumstance. It is as if the weight that pressed upon your days and followed you into your nights has been addressed at a level deeper than thought, where words are not merely spoken but established as reality itself. The declaration of divine closure does not arrive with noise or spectacle, yet it carries a finality that unsettles the old memory of pain, as though something long tolerated has now been officially dismissed from the structure of your becoming. You begin to sense that what once dictated your reactions, your fears, your hesitation, no longer holds the same jurisdiction over your spirit, and this realization does not come as a sudden victory, but as a slow unveiling, like dawn revealing a landscape that was always there, but hidden beneath heaviness. It is not simply that the suffering has faded, but that its claim over you is being revoked in ways the mind struggles to fully articulate. The days and nights that were once consumed by repetition of inner battles begin to feel distant, almost unfamiliar, as though they belong to a version of you that has already been spoken past. In this unfolding awareness, there is a strange mixture of disbelief and reverence, because the human heart often expects deliverance to arrive with example, explanation, yet here it arrives as a settled fact without negotiation. What once demanded constant attention begins to lose its voice, and what once felt permanent begins to reveal its temporary nature, not because time alone has passed, but because something higher has intervened in the very meaning of your endurance. And so you stand in a kind of inner silence where old fears attempt to echo but find no chamber willing to receive them in the same way. The authority they once held feels interrupted, as though a greater sentence has already been spoken over your story, one that does not compete with your pain but overrides it entirely. Even your memories begin to shift in tone, no longer binding you with the same intensity, because the narrative you once believed to be ongoing is now being rewritten at its foundation. There is a sacred interruption in the pattern of return, where what used to revisit your spirit no longer finds open doors, and this absence begins to feel like a presence. In itself, quietly affirming that something irreversible has taken place within the unseen order of your life. In this space, the soul learns to recognize that closure is not always dramatic, but often resembles a gentle yet absolute withdrawal of permission for certain seasons to continue their claim over you, and you find yourself standing in the strange awareness that what once consumed your days and nights has been spoken over, and therefore cannot continue in the same form again, and not because suffering has gained permanence, but because it never truly owned the timeline it seemed to occupy. There comes a hidden architecture behind every season of hardship, a design that the human eye only partially perceives while living through it. What felt like endless delay was never delay at all, but precision disguised as waiting, where even the slowest moments were quietly moving toward an appointed end. The recognition that pain had an expiry date written beyond human sight begins to reshape the entire memory of struggle, because it removes the illusion that chaos was in control. It was never the storm that decided how long it would stay, but a higher order that measured each wave, each silence, each breaking point with a wisdom that does not announce itself in advance. And so the mind begins to reconsider everything it once labeled as permanent. The nights that felt unbroken reveal themselves as segments within a larger passage, each one carrying a hidden limit that was never visible in the moment. Even the tears that seemed to flow without restraint were moving within boundaries already set, though those boundaries were only revealed after the weight began to lift. There is a strange reversal that takes place in hindsight, where what felt like endlessness is now seen as something carefully contained, as if every burden was permitted to speak only up to a certain point and no further. This awareness does not erase the pain, but it redefines its authority, stripping it of the illusion that it could extend beyond what was silently permitted. In this realization, the soul starts to sense that nothing you endured was open-ended, even when it appeared so. Every delay had a hidden limit, every silence had a concealed endpoint, every trial carried within it a sealed conclusion that could not be broken by fear or accelerated by desperation. The human spirit, while inside the experience, often confuses intensity with infinity, but what is intense is not necessarily eternal. There is a difference between what overwhelms and what lasts, and much of what nearly broke you belonged only to the former. The unseen order of things does not operate on human perception of duration, but on a deeper alignment where even suffering must obey its assigned frame, whether recognized or not. And as this understanding settles deeper, the weight of what was endured begins to shift from something that defined you to something that passed through you within a measured span already accounted for. And even now that realization continues to unfold without final closure, yet settling into quiet certainty that nothing you survived was ever beyond the reach of a pre-written ending. And in that pre-written ending there was always a hand that carried what your strength could not as a distant observer, but as a presence quietly threading itself through every fracture you thought was final. The unseen hand that carried you through what you thought would destroy you does not always reveal itself in the moment of rescue, because its work is often hidden inside the very endurance it sustains. You were not merely surviving by your own will alone, though it often felt that way in the isolation of struggle, where every breath seemed negotiated, and every step required a strength you were not sure you still possessed. Yet even in that uncertainty, there was a sustaining reality beneath your awareness, holding you in place when collapse seemed more natural than a continuation. There is a particular mystery in how a person can reach the edge of their own capacity and yet not fall beyond it, as though something unseen recalibrates the weight in real time, ensuring that breaking is never the final outcome even when everything within you predicted otherwise. The human mind tends to interpret endurance as self-generated, but there are moments when survival exceeds explanation, where the continuity of breath and movement becomes evidence of a support that does not announce itself. It is not loud, nor is it demanding recognition, but it is consistent in a way that reshapes the meaning of every close call, every delayed collapse, every instance where you thought the next moment would be the end of your ability to continue. And looking back, what once appeared as sheer resilience begins to reveal another layer, one that suggests you were being held even in the spaces where you felt entirely alone. The delays that frustrated you, the pauses that confused you, the interruptions that felt like abandonment were often the very structures through which unseen preservation was operating. What you interpreted as absence was, in a deeper sense, a form of guarded presence, where the outcome you feared was being quietly restrained from completing itself. There is a strange humility that emerges in this recognition, because it challenges the idea that you were the sole architect of your survival, while also honoring the strength that was allowed to remain active within you. And so the memory of your hardest moments begins to shift again, not as evidence of abandonment but as testimony of a sustaining force that moved without needing acknowledgement, carrying you through thresholds you were never meant to cross into destruction. And even now that awareness continues to unfold as you stand in the lingering aftertaste of deliverance that was never fully in your control, and yet was never without guidance, and then in that guidance there emerges a quiet atmosphere of peace that does not behave like ordinary relief, because it does not arrive as something you create, but as something that finds you when the conflict no longer has permission to define your inner world. The strange peace that arrives when struggle is no longer your portion is not the absence of memory, nor the denial of what was endured, but a deeper rearrangement of how those memories are allowed to exist within you. They no longer sit at the center demanding attention. Instead, they are pushed toward the edges of understanding, where they can be seen without being relived, remembered without being re-entered. This peace often feels unfamiliar at first, almost suspicious to a heart that has learned to equate intensity with reality. The mind, trained by seasons of pressure, keeps waiting for the return of tension, as though calm itself must be temporary. Yet what unfolds is a continuity of stillness that does not depend on circumstances agreeing with it. It stands where chaos used to stand, not as its opposite in conflict, but as its replacement in authority. The internal environment begins to shift, and what once responded instantly to fear or expectation of pain now hesitates, as though those old signals no longer carry the same command. There is also something disorienting about peace that does not require effort to maintain. It does not demand constant vigilance, nor does it ask you to fight for its survival. Instead, it reveals itself as something already established, waiting beneath the noise you once called normal life. And when the noise finally subsides, you notice that what you thought was emptiness is actually fullness without pressure, a kind of quiet order that does not need explanation to remain intact. The soul begins to recognize that rest is not weakness, but a different form of strength that does not announce itself through struggle. Even your reactions begin to change in subtle ways, as if the old reflexes are no longer aligned with your present reality. Situations that once triggered internal storms now pass with less authority, not because you are indifferent, but because something within you has shifted its center of gravity. You are no longer orbiting the same pain in the same way. The atmosphere around your thoughts becomes less reactive, more grounded, and this groundedness carries a strange dignity, as though you have been moved from a battlefield into a space where conflict is no longer the governing language. And even now, this quiet rearrangement continues to settle deeper into the fabric of your awareness, as a piece that was not negotiated but given its place and allowed to remain without resistance. And within that stillness, the human spirit begins to notice something it could not see while it was fighting for survival. That survival itself was never the final destination, but only a narrow corridor leading toward a wider sense of being, where existence is no longer measured by what it stands, but by what it is allowed to become after the pressure releases its grip. The realization that survival was never the end, but a passage into freedom, does not arrive as an idea alone, but as an internal reorientation, where the meaning of your past begins to shift under a new light that was not available while you were inside the struggle. There is a subtle difference between being preserved and being set free, and in the aftermath of prolonged struggle, that difference becomes the central revelation of the soul. Preservation keeps you intact through the storm, but freedom changes the very language in which you interpret storms altogether. What once defined your days by resistance begins to dissolve into something more spacious, where life is no longer organized around avoiding collapse, but around rediscovering motion without fear. The inner world, once structured around tension, starts to expand into unfamiliar openness, and that openness can feel almost unreal at first, as though you were stepping into a version of life you were not allowed to imagine while you were still inside confinement. And so you begin to see that much of what you called living was actually endurance disguised as living, where every choice, every thought, every expectation was filtered through the need to survive what was pressing against you. But freedom begins when those filters lose their authority, when the mind is no longer preoccupied with anticipating the next wave of pain, and instead starts to notice the quiet details of existence that were always there, but never fully received. Even simple moments begin to carry a different weight, not because they are louder, but because they are no longer overshadowed by the urgency of survival. This passage into freedom does not erase the memory of what was endured, but it removes its dominance over your present reality. The past no longer stands as a governing force, but becomes a testimony of transition, something that explains where you have been without dictating where you must remain. There is a slow, almost sacred unlearning that takes place, where the soul begins to release the habit of bracing itself against everything. And in that release, it discovers that life was never meant to be experienced only through endurance, but through a deeper unfolding that begins precisely when survival stops being the center and freedom quietly takes its place. And in that quiet taking of place, something far more delicate begins to emerge within the human spirit, as though identity itself is being gently rewritten without violence or urgency, but through the steady erosion of what pain once insisted you must remain. The rebirth of the self that pain tried but failed to erase is not dramatic in the way endings and beginnings are often imagined. It is subtle, almost imperceptible at first, like a new tone entering an old melody that slowly changes the entire song without announcing that it has done so. You do not become someone else in a way that abandons your past, but rather someone who is no longer imprisoned by it. There is a profound strangeness in realizing that what once threatened to define you is no longer capable of holding that authority. The memories remain, yet their interpretation begins to shift, as if the same events are now being read through a different inner language. Where once there was only fracture, there begins to appear continuity. Where there was only loss, there begins to appear meaning that does not demand explanation. The self that was shaped under pressure does not disappear, but it is no longer the final version of who you are becoming. It becomes a chapter rather than the entire book, a reference rather than a definition. And so the soul starts to notice small evidences of this rebirth in the most ordinary places, in thoughts that no longer collapse under old fears, in reactions that no longer obey ancient wounds, in moments where you pause and realize that you did know. Respond the way you used to. These are not signs of forgetting, but signs of transformation, where the weight that once dictated your internal posture no longer determines how you stand within yourself. There is a quiet dignity in this shift, because it does not erase what was endured, but refuses to let it remain as the final authority over your identity. Even your understanding of yourself begins to soften and widen, no longer confined to the narrow definitions formed during pain, but open to possibilities that were once inaccessible while you were surviving. The self that pain tried to reduce becomes something more expansive, more patient, more aware of its own continuity beyond rupture. And in this unfolding awareness, there is a sense that what was once thought to be the end of who you could become was only the moment before a deeper version of you began to emerge, and that emergence continues quietly, without resistance, without announcement, as if life itself is gently restored. What was never truly lost, and was only waiting for the weight to be lifted so it could be seen again in its original wholeness. And in that wholeness there settles a final kind of assurance, not born from emotion or momentary relief, but from a deeper settling of reality itself, as though the structure of your life has been quietly altered at its foundation and cannot easily be reversed by memory, circumstance, or fear. The sacred assurance that you will never return to what you have been delivered from again is not the kind of promise the mind tries to manufacture in hope. It is the kind of certainty that emerges after a door has been closed in a way that no longer allows the old pattern to find its way back into the same shape. There is something almost solemn about this recognition, as if you are standing at the edge of an old landscape that still exists in memory but has lost its power of invitation. What once pulled you back into cycles of dread, repetition, and emotion. Captivity begins to feel strangely distant, not because you have forgotten its intensity, but because its authority has been quietly revoked. The mind may still remember the routes it once walked in confusion, yet something within you no longer responds to those pathways, as if they are destinations you must revisit. It is as though the inner geography has been redrawn, and the roads that once led you into the same valleys of struggle now fade before they can be traveled again. This is not resistance born of effort, but a deeper kind of protection woven into the very fabric of your becoming. There is a subtle but undeniable shift in how temptation to return presents itself. It may appear in memory, in suggestion, in old emotional echoes, yet it no longer carries the same weight of inevitability. What once felt like gravitational pull now feels like a distant echo without substance, something that can be acknowledged without being entered. The soul begins to recognize that repetition is not destiny, and that familiarity is not the same as permission. In this recognition, a quiet strength forms that does not need to fight the past, because it is no longer governed by it. And so the assurance deepens, not as a loud declaration, but as a settled interior fact that no longer requires constant reinforcement. You begin to notice that even when you remember what you were delivered from, there is no corresponding collapse within you, no reopening of what has already been sealed in a deeper order. The very idea of return starts to lose its emotional architecture, as though the supports that once made it possible have been removed from beneath it. What remains is memory without bondage, reflection without relapse, awareness without re-entry. In this space, the soul learns a kind of final unfamiliarity with its former chains, not because they never existed, but because they no longer fit the structure of who you have become. And even now, as this assurance continues to set, the deeper than language can fully contain, there is a quiet realization forming within the unseen layers of your awareness that what has been concluded in one realm cannot be reopened by the echoes of another, and that you are standing in a continuity of deliverance that does not loop backward, but only moves further into a freedom that no longer recognizes the shape of return. And